Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of One Single Story. Today I'm joined by Pastor Jay Rivenbark, Pastor Chris Rexroad, and we're going to be looking at the theme of the book of 2 Kings. So that's where we're at this week. And the theme of 2 Kings is judgment that we consistently find poured out on the people. There are a lot of stories, some of them famous, not so famous. The book starts out with Elijah confronting King Ahaziah, and he sends troops, and every 50 men he sends, God burns them up. And, you have miracles that happen during the famine in chapter 4. Naaman gets healed of leprosy. Gehazi, who's Elisha's servant, gets struck with leprosy because he said he didn't take something, and he did. In 6, they're under siege from Ben-Hadad. In 7, the lepers take this chance on going and seeing if they, if there's anything to help them live, and they find nobody there. God's already ran the people off. In chapter 9, Jezebel dies. Jehu becomes king. In chapter 10, Jehu kills all of Ahab's family and the priest of Baal. In 11 and 12, you have Jehoiada and Joash both bringing religious reforms. But at the end of 13, you find Elisha pronouncing judgment on Jehoash because he doesn't smack the ground but 3 times with the arrows. 14 through 17, and we're going to talk about 17 today. You have multiple evil kings that rule, and the people suffer because of it. 18 is Hezekiah becomes king and seeks the Lord. In 19, Isaiah predicts Judah's deliverance. 20 is Hezekiah getting sick and recovering. 21, Manasseh is evil and promises, and God promises destruction. I read this last night in 21 that caught my attention. It said it would even make their enemies' ears tingle in horror that they would be destroyed so bad. 22, Josiah becomes king at 8 years old, and he starts religious reforms. But in 24 and 25, as it ends, we find Babylon taking control of Jerusalem and destroying the temple, which is the ultimate judgment that had been predicted would happen. Before we dig deep into the text today, do any of those stories stick out to you as it relates to the judgment of God, the work of God, what God was trying to do?
The whole book is about cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you see it very clearly, whether it was something God sent directly himself or whether it was something that he allowed. And it was always, though, as harsh as it is and as much death and destruction we see in the book, it ultimately was about God's love and him wanting them back in close relationship with him. And it, on the surface, is a little hard to see that sometimes unless you really look way beyond what you're reading.
Yeah, and I mean when you get to chapter 9 and Jezebel dies, I mean that's a big point of celebration to see things are starting to change. And then going through in chapter 10 when Ahab's family is pretty much completely destroyed, you can definitely tell that God is trying to clean things up, purge the problems out of the area, and to make a point.
At rereading last night, as I was preparing for this, I think the thing that out of the whole book that stuck out the most was Gehazi, if that's how you say it, Elisha's servant, so the story is Naaman comes to Elisha wanting to be healed. He tells him to go dip 7 times in the Jordan. It becomes this, there's a little bit of a conflict. It's not quite that simple. He's mad because he don't come out to him, but he does go dip 7 times in the Jordan. He is cured of his leprosy, and he has all of these gifts that he wants to give to Elisha, and Elisha says, no, I don't want it. I don't need it. And Gehazi's like, oh man, he can't let that get away, and so he runs after him and says, my master changed his mind, I think is essentially what he says. My master changed his mind. And then he takes the stuff. And then he suffers from the very same disease, him and his family, it says, for the rest of their life. The very same disease that Naaman was and it so we go from one man having leprosy to a whole family having it. And it was solely because of disobedience. That's not why Naaman has it. We don't have that indication that he's disobeyed, but we do see that Gehazi, and it reminded me that as leaders, as people of God, we are held to a higher standard. We have more accountability, and sometimes we're better off without the financial reward. So,
Yeah, I sometimes wonder how that story would have played out had he just ran after him and gone to him and said, look, he don't want any of that stuff, but I could sure use a
Right.
blessing right now, rather than lying about the pretense of, and we don't know the answer to that, but I'm always curious how.
Well, that's the danger, and I see it in the church. I sure, God, I hope I avoid it like the plague here, but I see pastors and preachers who, best case you could call it, manipulate the truth. Worst case you could call it is downright out like stealing.
Yeah.
And my experience is that if you do what's right, God will provide. And I'll give you an example. Just this past week, all right? So as we're sitting here right this minute recording this, they're installing our LED wall. We're having some changes to the room, and one of the things that we needed to do on that stage was put in a set of electronic drums to get the cage out of the way so the sight lines are good. Well, 2 years ago, last year, Kent had money in his budget for drums. And the set of drums I wanted was twice as much as what he had in his budget. And anyway, we were having some conversations on Slack. Sunday morning, I walked and talked to Alyssa about it, and I said, how much does he have in his budget? Because at that point, I didn't know. She said, 0. And I was like, so I was thinking, okay, we're going to have to come up with a few $1,000s creatively, and now we got to come up with a significant amount of money. And she said 0. Well, somebody else was there in the conversation, and they were like, well, how much is it? And I told them. They said, I'll pay for it. I was like, all right, deal. We'll do it then. And like what I have found is if you do the right thing, God will always provide. When you start trying to manipulate people and twist people, I would agree, Jay. I wonder how the story turns out. You got to believe the man was so happy to have been cleansed of his leprosy. If he had just said, you know what, I want some of it. Can I get it? Because I'm struggling down here. He ain't paying very well because he keeps sending y'all away. And I think he would have received it, right?
Perhaps so. It's just an interesting thought. But it circles back to motive. He could have had a conversation with the man of God and said, look, pay's been really poor here. I got no retirement plan or anything.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I go talk to him? I understand you not wanting to take any of it for appearance's sake. He said, but he didn't do those things. And so we only know how that did turn out.
Yeah, and I've helped people before that after the fact, I was disgusted I did because they lied to me. That if they had been truthful with me, I would have given even more.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I agree. I've had some of those instances too, where on the backside you find out what was presented or sold to you wasn't the truth at all, and no, end of that. Like you said, and the truth presented would have been completely different. Been willing to do even more, but it didn't work that way.
Yeah, and that can be somewhat frustrating. So
Mm.
for me, when I read through the story, back through Second Kings, and I was thinking that it bothers me. It bothers me to see people who should be used of God turn.
Lose out.
That's right,
Yeah.
and miss. I
Yeah.
mean, because think about it, he couldn't go with Elisha anymore.
Mm.
He couldn't travel with him. He couldn't help him. Like he was getting ready to be exiled himself. He lost all of it because he just
Yeah.
chose, you know.
Yeah, I mean, integrity is crucial in leadership, like we see it right here, and that could have very well been God's way of saying, you know what, you're going down the wrong path. I can't have you around these situations. Because people won't be able to trust you. Eventually, it's going to come out because people can't trust you. You probably won't trust my servant that people are coming to, and that's very similar today.
Yeah.
I mean, like you were kind of talking about, if you kind of got irritated with lending money to a person or doing a favor to a person, if we just simply let the person know what's really going on and be honest and be willing to accept the no, possibly, that person's going to trust you more in the future. And most likely people are still going to help you out, but just give them the honest perspective of what's really going on.
Mm-hmm. So today our text is going to be 2 Kings chapter 17, and we're going to transition over and talk about maybe some of the theological implications from this passage. So chapters 14 through 17 are like this repeated pattern of bad kings. We're going to look at chapter 17, and I'll read a few verses. It says, Hoshea, son of Elah, began to rule over Israel in the 12th year of King Ahaz's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria 9 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, but not to the same extent as the kings of Israel who ruled before him. So let's just talk about evil. Are there different levels of evil? How is evil measured? Evil is a pretty strong word. So what does God consider to be evil?
I'd say anything that contradicts him, his character, and our worship of him. Anything that could lead somebody astray as well.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, this denotes that there are different levels.
Not to the same extent.
That's exactly right. And I think we can see that in the world today. Sin is sin.
Mm-hmm.
But there are different consequences to different sin and behavior. And, sometimes we hear about events and crimes and things that people have done, and we go like, oh, that was bad. But then there are stories we hear about, and we're like, that's on a whole different level. That has reached a level of evil that's even beyond, quote, the norm, even for our society. And you're just like, that's rough. And so obviously, you can deteriorate to different levels.
Is the level of evil determined by the consequences? Is that how you would describe it?
You're saying, does that define it?
Can I jump in here?
Sure, please do.
Say I think really the ultimate goal or the motive of the person committing the act, for me, kind of defines the level of evilness on it. I mean, sure, the repercussions from it, should match what they're doing. Not always does that happen. Some people end up getting, let off on a much lighter sentence or something like that as far as the world's judgment goes, or our judicial system sometimes. But I think there's just like a difference, like Jay was just saying, I mean, between somebody that goes in and steals something from a store just for their own personal gain, whether they sell it or use it, versus somebody that goes and tries to destroy a person's life, whether it's physically, emotionally, or something, just goes to a deeper level of corruption and intent there. Both of them are wrong and both of them are sin. But you can go even darker into, like I have said before, that I'd like a lot of criminal shows and stuff like that. And you can definitely see the difference between crimes where people just go for their own personal gain versus where they try to do something just horrible to other people.
I think the consequences are pretty much what we have to judge the level of evil by. whereas God sees obviously the heart. And sometimes we have no clue about the level of evil. And I think that's I started to say scariest. Perhaps it is when people can be around you and are living at a level of evil, and we're not even aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there are two examples or two things I want to talk about as a follow up to that. One, Chris, while you were talking, two people's name came to mind: Martha Stewart and Bernie Madoff.
Yeah. Yeah.
From the outside, what I know, Martha Stewart, they found something they could put her in jail for, essentially, but it was insider trading, and she was solely seeking to benefit herself. It wasn't to cause somebody else harm. It was solely to benefit herself. In his case, he sought to benefit himself to the harm, detriment, literally like ruin people's lives.
People, yes.
For his own self-enrichment. Those I see as different. I even view those consequences or the results of that as different. I would say that the worst cases, Jay, to what you were speaking of, are the times that we don't identify it as evil or culture doesn't recognize there becomes this big cover-up. So let me see if I can give you some examples. For whatever reason, the last 24 months, I have been fascinated by the inner workings of investments, how they work and how people avoid paying taxes and stuff. So like I learned something just yesterday, brand new, that I didn't know. The majority, of big corporations have their cash in a form of life insurance. It is with an insurance company because it grows tax free. They pay no tax. Very, very similar to annuity. That's essentially what it is. But that's where they're putting their money, and these corporations aren't paying tax. Now, is that evil or not? They're just playing a game that's there. However, there are things that are made legal. There are no consequences culturally of doing them. That if you boiled them down, are almost evil because they're designed to keep this one group of people wealthy and in power. And they are also designed to keep this group of people uninformed, ignorant, and poor, oppressed is the right word. And there are times I'll see people, it could have to do with race. It could have to do with a cultural issue that may be going on, that there are people who step to the forefront, and every time this issue comes up, they're going to be the spokesperson for it. But they're just taking advantage of the people that they claim to be
helping.
That's right. They claim to be representing, and we don't recognize it. We think, oh, they're doing so good. But in my opinion, it is. I've seen. We talked about Gehazi earlier. I've seen preachers who were, in my opinion, evil. They were fleecing people. They had no intentions of those people doing any better, getting any better. They just wanted what they could get out of those people. And that's a level of evil that I think God in the end judges.
Oh, sure.
That's how I see it.
Kind of a rolling joke I've heard before, but it's pretty much true, which is definitely in politics, but it could be in this situation too, is that if you create a situation that you've resolved the problem, you're no longer needed. And I think a lot of people try to manipulate that so that they're always needed.
Right.
Without question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Lord, this could be a deep dive, and we need to get out of that. So verse 5 says, when the king of Assyria invaded the entire land, then the king of Assyria invaded the entire land. And for 3 years he besieged the city of Samaria. Finally, In the 9th year of King Hoshea's reign, Samaria fell and the people of Israel were exiled to Assyria. When you're experiencing God's judgment, is it better for it like to be carried out immediately, just boom, okay, deal with it? Or is this long, protracted demise?
I've experienced both.
Well, look, I'll speak to it like this, and I don't think it really has anything to do with judgment. And it's just and I think it's the way I'm geared. Both of my parents are still living. I pray that when they die quickly.
Absolutely.
I mean, just
Yeah.
I'd rather that happen suddenly. Like I'm not expecting it. I get a call from
Yeah.
one of them and says, "Hey, your mom passed
Yep.
away. Your dad passed away." Than for them for 3 or 4 or 5 years to suffer toward the end of your dad's life.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't years, but
Right.
I think it was 10 or 12 months. His health
Yeah.
was in pretty bad
Yeah.
decline, and it's hard to watch.
Yeah, sure it is. And I would have preferred to say, where a person's going that they're right with the Lord, you would prefer that it to be rapid. And as it relates to judgment, because this clearly was judgment, I do think there are times when a protracted judgment dealing with God or God dealing with us is beneficial, because I think sometimes if it comes too rapidly, we don't learn the lessons and change the behavior. I truly think I've seen that. I think sometimes a longer process is necessary. The sad part is it seems like they didn't even learn it through that process. You would think after 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, people would be repenting, calling out to God and changing their behavior and their ways. And apparently they did not. And so it seemed that neither was effective for them.
Yeah, that's definitely the case throughout this book right here. Just people constantly turning and going in the wrong direction, no matter what God seems to bring their way. But yeah, I mean, if it's prolonged, I mean, obviously it's more painful, it takes a lot longer and everything, but you have an opportunity to course correct. But if it's something that's immediate, especially if it results in death, you don't have a chance to repent and go back. You've had them before, but you don't get that opportunity to. So each one of and it speaks a pretty strong lesson to other people around you. They may benefit, and you won't get the opportunity. So each one of them, I think, has pros and cons to it.
I would agree.
But I would lean towards wanting something to be quick and over.
Yeah, let's pull the tooth and go.
Yeah.
I don't want to know about it either.
Yeah.
That whole pulling your tooth thing. The worst part of it was when they were tying the string to my tooth and then tying it to the door. It seemed like it took 14 hours.
Yeah.
But the pain of it was gone pretty quick. Because then you move on.
Yeah.
It's funny how those things stick with you. Verse 7 says that the disaster came upon them because they worshiped other gods. They were disobeying God. Do you believe that God still sends disaster upon individuals or groups of people who willfully disobey Him?
I can't think of any examples. I think that He's still capable of that, and I think that He has His ways of getting our attention. And this isn't necessarily because of people's evil actions and stuff, but, well, kind of. When we get so caught up in ourselves in this world, a world of self, usually, when natural disasters come, like there was just recently an earthquake over in Turkey area that a lot of people have died and buildings collapsed and tsunamis. People have a tendency of kind of stopping what they're doing and drawing in, and it creates local and global connectivity amongst people and gets people to actually start thinking about other people. So, I mean, a lot of times they can be used for good, but I can't really think right now of like a situation recently. But I think that He's definitely capable of doing it.
I would think of disaster not just in the sense of like a natural disaster or some cataclysmic event. I think disaster can be on a smaller scale. I think it can be individual. For me, I think, well, it is significant that these are Israelites. These are the people of God. that have sinned and rebelled and, quote, worship other gods. Whether he does or does not directly, the dangerous part is he can and obviously has a history of that. And I'm convinced that there are things that come into our life sometimes, it may not be so difficult on the front end, but they are attempts on his part to get our focus and our attention and to draw us back to him. And that's always the purpose, is to get us back in relationship.
Yeah, I will occasionally. What I see in the Bible are prophets who were very specific. I will occasionally now, when a natural disaster happens or something happens, hear prophets say that these, most of the time, self-proclaimed prophets. They'll point you back to a video that they made years ago that is still mostly vague. And in some roundabout way that could be perceived that they were pointing to whatever just happened. Things like natural disasters are a lot harder to pin down. But I do think there are some clear results of sin that we can see, that come upon people's lives, organizations, families, whatever, that they suffer from. I'm just curious though for y'all, like it seems like God has been long suffering and then all of a sudden, okay, it's time, for you to deal with this. What triggers the anger of God?
Well, we see throughout this very chapter at least two occasions, actually three that I've highlighted here, where it uses terms like it aroused the Lord's anger. His anger was kindled against Israel. And it seems to be directly related to willful, repeated choices and decisions to worship things other than him. I think that is significant, that it's not, at least based on this chapter, it doesn't appear that it was even a simple drifting away. It wasn't an occasional slip up. This was a long, habitual choosing things other than God. Even when they made accommodations to worship God, they continuously worshiped other gods and other things. And I think that's the driving force here. And he just gets to the point where he says, okay, enough's enough. I'm going to deal with this.
And then persuading other people to do it. I mean, not only you going and doing it, but then you're encouraging and teaching others to do it.
Influencing, other folks.
And
that's a different level.
Yeah. And then like what Joe was saying, they're not just going out and saying, hey, you know what, we're not getting what we want from the God of Israel. Maybe we'll go out and pray to this. I mean, they went beyond that and setting up all different kinds of poles and all different kinds of, I think that talked about the calf made out of metal and stuff. They actually took the time to build these things. And, what an insult to God. I mean.
I'm kind of chuckling. Did you call him Joe?
What'd I say?
That's what I heard. But
Did I say Joe? Did I say Joe?
It's okay.
I'm sorry.
It's
Sorry,
okay.
It was funny.
Still 3 letters.
We should just do a podcast and call each other by different names anyway for the fun of it. We should call people by the name that we're not called by. So yours is Alton. I don't know what yours is.
Like my middle name?
Yeah.
Oh, Scott.
Okay. Well, my middle name's Stephen, so we'll all go by our middle names and we'll be fine.
We're gonna use your first name.
I put a paper on a picture and it had my name. It was an envelope that I was taking notes on. It had my name, and people were freaking out. Your name is Ronald. I had no idea your name was Ronald.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I don't think I knew that.
Now you do. Yeah. With my red hair and a first name like Ronald, I got called Ronald McDonald more times than
I guarantee
you can count when I was growing up. Verse 13 talks about warnings from God. It said again and again, the Lord sent his prophets and seers to warn both Israel and Judah, turn away from their evil ways and obey his commands. What kind of warnings does God send us today?
Well, the obvious ones I think would be his word. I mean, it's fairly easy to read the word of God in contrast to what we know is wrong. We can establish right or wrong. Anytime, hopefully when we go to church, we listen to teaching or preaching. that we're reminded, and there are some warnings. I think there should be, to some degree, some warnings. You know, if you do this, this is what God says. If you do this, this is the result of that. Those would be, I think, the most obvious. There are times I'm convinced when the Holy Spirit speaks to us directly about things, gives us a warning. Sometimes He'll use other people, which I think, for me, are probably the most dangerous in that,
Difficult.
because you're not sure of their motivation, you know, where they're coming from. But He does use a multitude of ways, even today.
I would agree with that.
And we can see the warnings in examples of people that have, I guess, fallen around us,
Yeah.
whether local, across the nation, in the news, things that we might be getting caught up in ourselves that are secretive, you know, and then we start to see other people fall because of those things, whether they're believers in God or not. We just see the natural repercussions that come from those, and it's a good warning to us.
I'm always amazed at the people who can see other people have consequences of stupidity, sin, wrong, evil, and still go try to do it.
Yeah.
I've done it. I mean,
Me too.
so as you get to the end of that, toward the end, verse 25, it says, the king of Assyria transported groups of people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and resettled them in the towns of Samaria, replacing the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and lived in the towns. But since these foreign leaders did not worship the Lord when they first arrived, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. This is back to that judgment of God today. Do you believe that God still sends lions, and it may come in a different form, to non-worshipers? Or the way this might be how I would read this. It's not just non-worshipers. It is people who had taken over what was His place, and were now occupying it. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, the natural lines, perhaps not, but other forms of, not just attacks, because it said which killed some of them. Doesn't give us a number, doesn't seem to indicate that there were perhaps even large numbers, but just enough that it caused people to take note. It put some fear into people. I find it interesting. It says that they did not worship the Lord when they first arrived. It would indicate to me that the consequences were designed to get them started out on the right foot, in the right direction, right out of the gate, to establish a pattern, as you said, that God wanted, even if they were, quote, foreigners who had come in and replaced Israelites, that He wanted to establish how He wanted them to respond.
I mean, in today's day and age, it's very easy if God's able to see that there's a corruption in an organization, a corruption somewhere, that He may not necessarily send people in there to cause problems, but He can easily hold back His hand on that organization if they're going to choose to go their own way, to allow them to deal with the problems that are coming, and if He needs to, go ahead and let some other problems come along the way. Today, we wouldn't refer to them as lions, but wolves in sheep's clothing. I mean, that's a common phrase that we, as Christians, talk about today of corruption, and we definitely see that.
Yeah, I think, and I'm speaking for myself, having been raised in church, I think generally we look at, quote, lions, those who bring attack, disruptions, even within the church, as they have come in from the outside because we are doing God's work and following God's plan, when in fact we may need to ask ourselves the question, when those oppositions come, those attacks come, even from within, we may need to ask the question, Lord, is this because I'm not following the plans, the church not tracking the way You want us to do, that it can be twofold.
All right, well, let's transition over and talk about some of the practical applications maybe we can learn from some of these evil kings. All right, so let's take a look at some of the practical applications from this passage. So this becomes this continuous cycle over and over again. Good king, bad king. Things improve, things get worse. Turn to other gods. God seems to only be able to get their attention when things are just, the world's falling apart. How are we like that today? And what are some examples maybe you can give of that?
Well, one of the big ones that I remember is wrapped around 9/11. When the Twin Towers came down. It's very easy to be caught up in our own world, and something catastrophic happens. And at that point there, people really kind of boil down to, I need to get back to God. I need to go see what God wants on this. I need to pray to God because everything seems to be out of my control right now, even if we had control. And that was when churches were filling up weekends, weekdays, prayer, all kinds of stuff. And I think when things like that happen, or financial plummeting in your life, or nationally or globally, all different kinds of things, usually when we feel out of control.
Yeah, I tend to see it on a more recurring basis, an individual or perhaps a couple. They're in a marriage crisis. You mentioned financial crisis, a health crisis. That oftentimes that will stir people. Maybe you've not seen them, you've not heard from them in any capacity, and a crisis kind of drives them back.
But when you do see them.
Yes, that there's something going on. There's a need. There's a desire, and I'm not saying that within itself is a bad thing. It's good that you know where and how to respond. But sadly, so many times it seems like once the crisis is averted, they're out of trouble. Then they kind of go back to what they were doing, the way they were doing it.
Yeah, so in those crisis moments, what we see is people either revert to things like alcohol. So like 2001, 2008 would have been an example. This would not have been the same in 2020 because, and you understand, but 2001, 2008 specifically, and you can go back historically and see this, the two places that experienced the biggest increase in business are the bar and the church. Now, that didn't happen in 2020 because they closed the bars and the churches down. But in crisis, people either, they're seeking some kind of comfort. The thing I would say about, so 9/11 is fresh in my mind, fairly fresh, but they're short-lived.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, George W. Bush would have been president then, and the couple months following, his approval ratings were like 93, 94%. Everybody's, patriotic, got flags, but it didn't take long for that to wane.
Yeah.
And that's somewhat that you see here. As a matter of fact, politicians know this. There's always this skepticism when a crisis happens during an election year that politician is manipulating a crisis to try to get people to come together and say, oh, we need this leader, and but it's always short-lived, and I think the same was true in Israel. They had moments where they would go, man, we need to turn back to God. There'd be a leader. But it didn't. It was short-lived. I mean, in the big scheme of things, and I think typically people come toward God when they need His help, when they want something from Him, and tend to stray when they don't need something, when they feel like they're self-sufficient. Everything is everything is fine. And that seems to be the pattern of Israel. It's this horrible up and down ride that it's difficult to read. I
Yeah.
can't imagine
Yeah.
living it.
Yeah.
What causes people to stray so far away from God? And I'm not talking about people who know nothing about faith. I'm talking about people who are either raised in the church, raised by good, godly parents, people who once were living their life following after God, and then they deviate. And that it's not like they just make a mistake and come back. It's like they keep down this path that just seems to never end. What causes people to stray so far away?
Well, a couple that popped in my mind are self-seeking, self-pleasure. I mean, a lot of things that just revolve around fulfilling your wants and desires. And then the other one is something horrible happening to them, either by somebody in the church or that they had this misunderstanding and they used the phrase, well, my God wouldn't allow that to happen. Like I prayed and prayed and my mother still died. So I'm done with God. I'm moving on to something else. The misunderstanding that your God is there to provide what it is that you want, but us having to understand that at times his plan trumps what it is that we're wanting at the time. So just the misunderstanding of who God is can easily cause somebody to stray.
On a very practical level, I think part of it is, and we see this quite often. Somebody's in crisis. Let's say it's a marriage issue. They come in, and really, I think most couples in crisis want to come in. They want to spend maybe 30 minutes with you. They want you to pray a spectacular,
They want to
supernatural,
vomit on you.
anointed prayer, and they want you to give them a blessing and send them on the way, and everything's wonderful. When the reality is, if they're not willing to change behavior and put in work moving forward from that point, they will revert right back to where they were. And I think in the church that we often miss that. I don't care if it's in relationships, it's in finances, even related to our health. There are things that we have a responsibility to continue to grow and move toward the goal we want to be at. Otherwise, in that vacuum, you just go right back where you were. And I'm convinced on a spiritual level, these were great examples here. It happens to us individually and even in the church today. It is insufficient to say, okay, I'm in a relationship with God, I'm part of his family. You have to be actively involved in the process and in the relationship, growing, developing, and moving forward, or that vacuum will draw you right back to where you were, and you get there, and you may not even know how you got there. But I would argue it's in the absence of being proactive and doing things that we need to do to foster the relationship.
Yeah, and I think some of it is almost thrill seeking. And you can do this on the spiritual side too. Like I know some people who they're looking for the new thing in church, no matter the new fad, the new, where's the fire burning the hottest, they're like a firefly, and if they don't stay and try to help you get the fire built back up, I'm gonna go to the next fire, but on the other side, I think sin is has much that same attraction. We do something, it becomes normal, then we want that next big thrill. We're like the addict that goes from this drug to this drug to this drug, and they're looking for a bigger high, a more prolific thrill,
an intense experience.
That's right.
Sin is never stable; it's always progressive.
That's right.
By its nature.
Yeah, you're not just a little sinner. You're gonna continue down a path that eventually you're gonna do some things that are horrible. Verse 33, it says, "And though they worship the Lord, they continue to follow their own gods according to the religious customs of the nations from which they came." And this is still going on today. They continue to follow their former practices. In what ways today do we claim to follow Jesus, but some of our actions point to other gods or belief systems in our life?
I guess one of the things that I see with Christians today, and I've been guilty of in the past, is, if we say that God's our priority, but we make very little time for Him, we're not involved in the areas to connect with the rest of the church community and to grow personally. We allow our calendars to be ruled by something else. We allow our finances to be ruled by something else, whether it's for our own personal pleasure and gain or that we've just applied it elsewhere. And the same investment into our marriage and our kids and stuff, that if we're not actually making God first, then we are allowing other things to pop up as idols.
Yeah, I would agree. In that manifests itself in a lot of ways, because when I first read this, I was asking myself the question, how is that even possible? That you can, one, worship the Lord, but yet continue to follow your own little g gods. And as you said, we see it all the time. Where the house of God's not a priority, giving and generosity is not a priority, relationships are not a priority, and the list goes on and on and on. We do some things over here that resemble worship to God, but then we pursue all these other things that are little g gods in our life.
And I mean, like some of the stuff that we read here in this chapter where people offered up their children in burnt sacrifices and stuff like that, it's just kind of like, well, a lot of people are like, well, we don't do that today. It's like, well, we just do it in a different form where, the subject of abortion and stuff like that, where people have different takes on stuff that they follow Christ, but they are okay with this other thing, whether it's because they want to have peace with certain friends or because of something they've experienced or done and they want to justify it, and with a lot of other hot topics that we deal with today as well.
So can you have other gods, obvious sin in your life, and still be a follower of Christ, worship Him?
You want to start, Joe?
Joe's going to be silent. I think my best response, I think we all do that to some degree, regardless of the awareness level of it. I think the real question is, are we progressing toward God and away from those other little g gods, or are we intentionally going toward the little g gods and away from God? I think that's the determining factor.
Right. That's along the same lines of what I was thinking, that if there's not repentance and change happening in your life, then in my opinion and what I've studied, you're essentially kidding yourself. You're creating a hybrid version of Jesus, of God, and hybrid doesn't cut it. None of us are perfect, but if you're intentionally saying, I'm going to have this Jesus, but I'm going to have these things here along the way, and you're playing the buffet game of what you want from Jesus, but you're going to take these other things, it doesn't line up.
I think we have certain issues in the church that we think are deal breakers, and other things that we just like, well, everybody's a sinner, everybody sins, I do think direction matters. I think like that really matters. The struggle that I think we have is how far along the path is the person. If it's rebellion, that's different than I haven't dealt with it yet, or God hadn't dealt with it yet. If their answer is, I know, somebody who says, I'm not sure I see that the way you do, I feel differently about, than the person who says, I know it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's just a different
Yeah.
person.
I agree.
And so I think it's a challenge for us, though, in the church, because we want that clarity. You know, I can say the church I grew up in, that would not have been the case, at least on some specific issues, like you were in or you were out.
Yeah.
There was no you're in and you still have this issue,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and the danger I think with that is, well, there's some benefits in that there are some clear markers, there's some clear parameters,
And that's what they want.
and boundaries.
That's what people want.
The danger with that is you can't measure the internal issues that you can't see. You know, the quote secret things, which were addressed in this chapter too. They had some secret things going on as well that created a problem. And so, you know, if we only measure the external things and we fall within those parameters, we kind of give ourselves a big check mark, you know, a gold star. But that doesn't address the internal things that may be hidden.
Thank you all for joining us this week. I hope you'll be back next week. Make sure you like the video if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe there as well. You can do that on whatever your podcast platform that you're listening to. Make sure you get the downloads each and every week. We enjoy being a part of your life. We appreciate you being a part of what we're doing here. Have a great week.